You're listening to the Catholic Wives Desiring Peace podcast. Today's episode is When is it worth reconsidering contact? Are you a Catholic wife grappling with challenging in-laws? The Catholic Wives Desiring Peace podcast is your sanctuary for navigating these sometimes stormy seas of life with toxic in-laws while being validated for what you've experienced. Join me, your host, Miriam Susan, a Catholic wife who's weathered nearly 3 decades of in-law drama, as we tackle the tough issues you're dealing with head on. Hi, welcome to today's episode. I'm your host, Miriam Susan, and today we're going to be talking about this topic: when is it worth reconsidering contact? Now, this is assuming that you are already at least low, but most likely no contact with your in-laws. What kind of situations should you consider getting back into contact with your in-laws? And before we dive into the situations where you might want to consider that, we need to take a moment and really acknowledge the weight and complexity of this kind of decision. This is not a knee-jerk reaction. This is not something that you probably will just make a spur-of-the-moment decision. It takes time, because it probably took a lot of time and a lot of prayer and a lot of talking back and forth with your husband to come to the decision of going low or no contact. I also want to recognize that if you are in this situation, it's probably because there are some very serious life events that are happening. But I also want to state that there is no universal right answer. There isn't. Every situation is unique. Every situation has subtle nuances that make it different from somebody else's. So that's why I wanted to broach this topic and talk about some of the things that you need to think about, some of the things that you and your husband need to consider and prayerfully talk about before deciding to reconsider going into contact with your in-laws. Now, one of the first things we need to think about is, what are your motivations? And when I say I'm talking about yours and your husband's, because hopefully you are making this decision together. Hopefully this is not something that just one of you is leading, that you have considered the fact that you both decided to go no contact, and now you both need to be involved in this process of deciding to establish contact again. Now, there are two sides of this. Oftentimes, there is the I feel guilty, I feel bad, they're my mom, they're my dad, they're my in-laws, and, this is a big thing, and we should get back into contact with them, versus a genuine desire for some sort of reconciliation because of the circumstance. Those are two very different things. One is kind of not the right motivation, I would say. Feeling guilty over something, feeling guilty over withholding information or withholding a relationship because of different circumstances, to me, that's not a valid reason for going back into contact with people that were toxic enough that you pulled back in the first place. Now, if there is a genuine desire for reconciliation, if you have seen some things change in them, then I do think it's worth considering getting back into contact with your in-laws. Now, it's important to consider Catholic teachings on forgiveness and on boundaries. We are not forced to reconcile with anyone, period. We're not. Are we called to forgive? Yes. But even that has some nuances in it. There's a chapter in Luke that kind of leaves it in question whether forgiveness should be granted to someone who is unrepentant. So it's definitely important to take some time and read through the church's teachings, read through the catechism, and understand the difference between forgiving someone and setting your boundaries aside to reestablish contact with someone who has, again, done something to you, to your family, to your husband, to your children, that caused you to take this firm stand of low or no contact. There is also an important thing to know, and that is, forgiving someone is not the same as restoring that relationship. You can forgive someone. I have forgiven my in-laws and continue to, for the things that they have done and the things that they continue to do. But that does not mean that I'm ready to restore a relationship. There's a difference between that. Reconciliation, restoring that relationship, has to include some repentance, has to include a change of behavior. And unfortunately, we haven't seen that. So while my husband and I both have forgiven them, we are still maintaining our boundaries and not seeking at this point to restore that relationship. We also need to think about, in terms of our motivations, are we doing this? Are we reconsidering contact because of external pressure from other family members or even from our church community? Often these people that put that pressure on us, they only have one side of the story. And if they're really pushing you to reestablish contact, they probably only know the toxic person's side of the story. Or they place their own images, their own experiences with their own parents or with their own in laws onto your situation, and it doesn't apply. People who have healthy relationships with their parents and in laws, they oftentimes do not understand what we are going through because they haven't experienced it. They might feel like they're doing the right thing by encouraging you to get back into contact, but without the full context, it might actually be dangerous advice to heed. So, what are some of the catalysts? What are some of the reasons why you might be considering contacting your in laws again? Well, one of the things that I see a lot is hearing from your toxic in laws or hearing from extended family that there has been a diagnosis of a terminal illness. One of the things we need to process with this information, number one, is it true? It is not unusual to hear stories of toxic people who will say, this might be her last Christmas. This might be dad's last Easter. This might be whatever it is. And sometimes it's not exactly true. Sometimes toxic people love to play the victim. Well, oftentimes, toxic people love to play the victim. And if there is any kind of opportunity for them to use whatever they can, including them not having the best of health, to try to manipulate you into getting back into contact with them, they'll use it. And that's really sick. Honestly, that is really, really sick to use the death of someone or the potential death with a terminal illness of someone to force you to get back into contact. So, first, you need to consider, is this even true? Is there any proof that this person actually has this diagnosis? And then, if you determine that it is true, we really should take some time to think about the finality of the situation. If this person does have a terminal illness, if they do pass away, is that something that we can deal with if they do not change? We need to think about, does reconciling or an attempt to reconcile through reestablishing contact, does it serve a point of healing? Does it help heal anything? Or is it more likely that it risks reopening wounds? My husband and I have talked about this many, many times. And because of the risks to our family, we have decided that it doesn't matter what kind of information is thrown our way in terms of a terminal illness, in terms of any of the other points that I'm going to bring up later in the podcast. It doesn't warrant us opening ourselves up to more toxic behavior, and for our children as well. Which brings me to the next point, is that we have to consider the impact on our immediate family's well-being. If we do reestablish contact with, let's say, a toxic father-in-law who has a terminal diagnosis of, some sort of cancer, does that put our children at risk? If he has an enabling wife, and then the children will be around her, or if you have the golden child sister-in-law who is toxic towards your family, what does that mean if you reestablish contact because of that diagnosis, in terms of how is your family going to be treated? And then a hard thing to talk about is the complexity of the grief that comes when these relationships are strained. If your husband does receive a note, a message, word from family that somebody in his family has a terminal diagnosis, there will be grief. There will be grief, not just because of the sadness that you feel when someone you care about, someone you love, has this kind of diagnosis, but also because the relationship is not what it should be. And so there is a different kind of grief that comes along with these kinds of situations. Another situation that might be causing you to reconsider contact with family is a death in the family. If there's a death, there will probably be a funeral. And so we have to think about, what does that look like going to funerals with all the family around? And the family gatherings that will probably take place around that funeral. Those can be very challenging. And if you have been no contact, and if that toxic person has spread a bunch of slanderous lies about you, and your family decides that you want to pay your respects and go to the funeral, there's probably going to be people there who are upset that you're there because of how you, maybe in their minds, turned your back on the family, turned your back on this person when they needed you, turned your back, and then now all of a sudden they see you showing up for the funeral as pretending like nothing happened. There's a lot of things to consider. There's a lot of things to consider. And we need to figure out how we're going to manage expectations during this time of a family's collective grief. Because your aunts and uncles, your husband's aunts and uncles, his cousins, they're going to be grieving that person very differently than your family will. They're going to be expecting you to grieve in a certain way, even when families are not strained, even when there's not this added layer of complexity due to going low or no contact. There's still issues dealing with how everybody in the family deals with their grief. So adding in that layer of, oh, well, you've been low or no contact, and here you are at the funeral, that's going to be something you have to think about. That's going to be a challenge. Also, we need to think about, if you do go to a funeral, how do you protect your boundaries while showing respect? Do you have an exit plan for the funeral if somebody starts coming up and attacking you or your family? How are you going to deal with that? And then, how do you support your husband through this grief process? We know this time is coming for our family. We know it is. My husband has 2 living grandparents. Their time is limited on earth. And we know this time is coming, that one of them is going to be passing away, and we are not going to be going to the funeral because of the issues that we have with his parents. As much as we would love to show our respect, we know what would happen if we showed up at a funeral. We know that family members have been turned against us. We know that there will be members who are very outspoken and ugly and not care to be respectful of the atmosphere of a funeral and decide to come and say something to us and be confrontational. That is not something we're going to walk into. We have decided that we will pray for that family member when they pass on, pray for their soul, and offer support to my husband's family from a distance through prayer alone. That's it. Now, some other situations that you might be faced with that cause you to consider breaking no contact is a serious life change, like a birth or a marriage. And there's situations where you do feel a lot of pressure to tell a family member that you're having another baby. But again, we have to always go back to thinking about, why did we go no contact in the first place? Why did we pull back in the first place? Does sharing this information improve the relationship at all? Does it change anything? Probably not. There are a lot of pressures with these changes, with marriages, with births, with the traditions that come along with them. And it's difficult when you're having another baby and your friends who are not super close ask about the grandparents. You have to think about, what's your answer going to be? How are you going to respond to those kinds of things? Another big time life event that might happen is baptism or confirmation. Your children receiving their sacrament. Those are big things. And it can be awkward to be the one family who doesn't have any extended family at those celebrations. That was us. We had children come into the church. We had children receive their sacraments, and it was just us. And you know what? It was a little bit hard, but at the same time, we have chosen family who came and supported us. So there wasn't this void that we had. But I can understand that for those special situations, it is hard. It is hard to not have family present. But again, we have to take a step back and think, okay, are we upset about the idea of family being there or the actual family that we have? Because a lot of times we will idealize our in laws, our family members who are toxic, and we just don't take the time to think about, yeah, this really is not a healthy situation, and I don't want to bring this into and taint my son's baptism. I really don't want to bring this in and taint my daughter receiving her first Holy Communion or her confirmation. So, what are some really important questions that you need to ask to help you discern whether you should break your no contact and get back into contact with your in laws? Think about, has there been any evidence? Have you seen any evidence of change in their behavior? Have your toxic in laws changed at all? Or are they still in those same toxic patterns that caused you to go no contact in the first place? And then think about, what are some of your non negotiable boundaries? What are ones that it doesn't matter what's happening, this will not be changed? Think about those kinds of things. Think about, how is this going to impact not only your children, but your marriage? This stuff affects our marriages. You know. We need to think about that. How is this going to change how things are right now with your husband? Are you at a point in your life where you are spiritually and emotionally prepared for potential disappointment? That's what often happens with these situations, is those of us who have toxic in-laws or toxic parents, we go into these situations and we really have high expectations. We really think things are different. Things are going to be different this time. Things are going to be better. And then they're not. And I know what that's like, to have my husband go into situations thinking, maybe this one time, maybe this time will be different. And then him walking away from it feeling like he was steamrolled. It's really hard. It's really hard to be on that side where maybe you kind of knew and you submitted to the leadership of your husband to take that step and try. And what you knew what was going to happen actually happened. And how do you help your husband deal with that kind of disappointment? And then finally, another thing to think about in terms of discerning whether it's the right time is, what kind of support system do you have in place? Do you have a therapist? Do you have a priest who really understands the gravity of the situation you're dealing with? Do you have friends who you can lean on, who understand, who are non-judgmental, who love you unconditionally, that can help walk with you during this process? What are some warning signs that it might not be time to reach back out? Well, if you still see persistent manipulation tactics, nope, not worth it. If you see a consistent denial of their past behavior, a lack of awareness of what they've done, even if you've told them, that's a no-go for me. If there's an attempt to triangulate family members against you, where they maybe pull your husband's brothers and sisters and they try to convince him to get back in touch, no, that's not going to work. If there's any pressure to just forgive and forget, just let the past be in the past, let bygones be bygones, no, that's just a really manipulative way to say, you need to be the bigger person, you need to let it go, and we're not going to change. That's really what it's saying. Or do you still see resistance to respecting your simply stated boundaries? Do you still see your in-laws trying to text your kids? Are they still sending gifts when you ask them not to? Are they still doing the things that made you go no contact? If so, it's probably not time to reconnect. Now, if you do choose to reconnect, even if you've seen some of those things, but your husband just feels very strongly that he should get back in touch with his parents, these are some things that you need to consider. It is really important for you and your husband to have measured expectations. Don't expect things to be picture perfect. His parents might decide to love bomb you and shower you with gifts and praise and all these kinds of things, but know that that's not necessarily a change in behavior. If you choose to reconnect, I would still maintain some very strong boundaries. For me and my husband, we decided if there's ever a point where we think his parents have possibly changed, there will be zero contact with me or the children until there has been sufficient evidence that there has been change. That's it. That will be our strong boundary. My husband can talk with them. He can have some communication with them, but there will be no contact with the children. Period. If they maintain those, that if they have that respect for the boundaries, then we will consider the next step. But we have to consider our family's well-being. We have to. Our family's well-being is the reason why we went no contact. And that's probably part of the reason why you went no contact. So if you choose to reconnect, you have to constantly be thinking about your family's well-being. Also, you have to think about what is your exit strategy. What if you reconnect and things just go sideways? What are you going to do? How are you going to get out of the situation? How are you going to break away? You've got to think about those kinds of things. And I would strongly consider having a therapist or somebody who will have your back or your husband's back if things don't go the way that he hopes that they will. Or even if they do, to deal with the conflicting emotions of what that all is. Like, why are they all of a sudden like this? Why are things all of a sudden good now? And are they really good? So having that professional support, super, super important. Super important. Now, on the flip side, if you choose to maintain your distance, even after a terminal illness diagnosis, even after a baby is born, even after a death of a loved one, we'll have to manage the guilt and the social pressure that come from being no contact or being low contact, because there will be from somebody, most likely, that will try to pressure you into getting back into contact and trying to make you feel guilty for not having contact during that difficult time for your husband's family. And then we have to look for peace and find the peace with our decision. We have to have that peace in order to heal and move on. We can also look for alternative ways to honor family connections. You can share good memories with your children of your in-laws. Your husband can do that. He can share any good memories that he has of his childhood. That's a way to honor those family connections without putting your family in harm's way. And then it's important to honor our husband's individual choices. Maybe you're the one that feels like you should reinstate contact in some way, shape, or form, but your husband doesn't want to. You've got to honor his choice, honor him as the leader of your family, and respect that and allow him to make that decision because it's his parents. Now, balancing Catholic and Christian charity with personal boundaries can be hard. It can be hard because culturally we're taught to oftentimes just be a doormat, just let them go, let the in-laws do what they need to do. But that totally ignores our unique personhood, our autonomy, our God-given right to be an individual. And with that, we have to find peace with these difficult decisions. Just because we make a difficult decision does not mean that there is not peace. The role of prayer in these types of situations cannot be understated. It cannot. These types of situations have brought my husband and I closer to the Lord than anything else we've gone through. And just last night, my husband and I were talking, and I was thinking back and I thought, the only times really when we have struggled in our marriage had something to do with his parents. And so there is a peace that comes with knowing that now we have a huge source of conflict out of our relationship. And that came through so many hours of prayer, so many hours spent in prayer. If you have an option to seek out a spiritual director, definitely consider that. For us, it's been hard to find. They're not easy to come by where we live. My husband found a really great one that he has seen on occasion, but that might be an option outside of speaking with your local priest about what's going on. And just having somebody else to pray for you it's amazing. It's amazing. It's also a valuable thing to find some scripture passages on family relationships and finding scripture passages on peace. Now, I do want to remind you that this is a personal journey. Each of us can go through this in a very different way, and our journeys will not be the same. There is a process of ongoing discernment, a process of constantly thinking about this situation. And eventually you get to the point where there is some healing and there is some peace where you're not constantly second guessing everything that you've done. But there should be, at least for a time, some discernment on a regular basis of, is this the right decision to make? Especially with these situations of these instances that bring up this idea of, ooh, do I need to contact my parents about what's going on? I want to let you know that I understand how big of a struggle this is. I know it's hard. And I want to validate your experiences, that it is hard, that even though you've gone no contact, it doesn't mean that you're heartless. It doesn't mean that you all of a sudden have no feelings towards these people. Many of the family members, most of the family members that we're not in contact with, we love deeply. And it is very hard to not have them in our lives anymore. Unfortunately, the consequence of getting back in contact with them means getting back in contact with our in-laws. And that's not feasible. That's an option that's not on the table for us. So I understand how difficult this is. I encourage you to pray regularly for wisdom in these circumstances. Pray for peace. Pray for God's supernatural peace because it's there waiting for you. It's not easy to get. It takes work. It's almost like mining for diamonds. You have to go through a lot of dirt. You have to sweat and do a lot of work to find that little nugget of peace. But when you find it, oh my goodness, it is so precious and can literally change your life. I hope this podcast has been an encouragement to you if you are facing these decisions where something has happened and you're torn between getting back into contact with your toxic family members or not. It's not an easy decision. I encourage you, if you're not facing this at the moment, to take some time and talk to your husband about it. You know, what will we do if we find out that dad has cancer? What will we do when we find out mom is dying? What will be our decision? How will we decide? What will we do? Those are things to talk about, preferably before they happen. But if you're in the thick of it right now, know that I'm praying for you. Know that you're in my prayers. And I understand how much this it stinks. It stinks to be in this situation. But know that God is near. He is there to comfort you in ways that only He can. And He seeks for your heart and for your family. God bless you. Go in peace. Hi, Miriam Susan here. I wanted to point out a new feature for you to reach out with any questions that you might have. It is an audio message submission option on my website, desiringpeace.com/podcast. If you have any questions, if you just want to reach out, if you just want to tell me, hey, thank you, I really appreciated this episode, I would absolutely love to hear from you. If you decide to submit a question, it could be chosen to be played here on the podcast or for me to just answer it if it makes more sense for me to just address your question without playing your audio. But I will be in touch if you reach out. Just send me a quick note. Go to desiringpeace.com/podcast. Submit your audio message now. Thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. If you've ever wondered just how toxic your relationship with your in-laws really is, I've got the perfect tool for you. Introducing the new free Toxic In-Laws Assessment, a self-graded quiz designed to help you identify the true level of toxicity in your relationship with your in-laws. Whether you're unsure if your in-laws are really that bad or you think they might be worse than you realize, this assessment will give you the clarity you need. Don't leave it to guesswork. Take the free Toxic In-Laws Assessment now and start your journey towards healthier and more peaceful family dynamics. Visit desiringpeace.com/quiz to get started. Disclaimer. All content and information on this podcast and our website, including our programs, products, and/or services, is for information and educational purposes only and does not constitute professional medical, psychiatric, or mental health advice of any kind, and does not establish any kind of professional-client relationship by your listening to this podcast or use of my website. A professional client relationship with you is only formed after we have expressly entered into a written agreement with you that you have signed, including our fee structure and other terms to work with you in a specific matter. Although we strive to provide accurate general information, the information presented here is not a substitute for any kind of professional advice, and you should not rely solely on this information. Always consult a professional in the area for your particular needs and circumstances prior to making any professional, medical, or mental health related decisions.